Welcome to WSJ Live. I'm Clemency Burton-Hill. Now, yesterday, a bill that would ban American families from adopting Russian children was unanimously passed by the Russian parliament. And today, despite waves of criticism in both Russia and the US, President Vladimir Putin has said that he has every intention of signing the bill into law, meaning that it will come into effect on January 1st. Our WSJ reporter Mike Esterl is in our Atlanta bureau, where he's been talking to some of the American families who'll be affected by the ban. Good morning, Mike. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning.
Now, first of all, just briefly remind us of the context of this ban. It's retaliation against US legislation that was enacted earlier this month against Russian human rights violators. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, it's called the Magnitsky Act, and it's named after a Russian hedge fund operator who died in prison in 2009 after alleging widespread corruption in government ranks. And it involved hundreds of millions of dollars. Under the act, basically visas and assets can be frozen of Russian officials who may have been involved in corruption.
Now, many people are pointing out the irony that American attempts to legislate against human rights violations are now meaning that Russians are targeting what many people say are exceptionally vulnerable targets, namely Russian orphans.
That's right, and that's an argument that's being made in the U.S., but also in many circles in Russia. There's a couple things going on. One is there was a poll that came out recently in Russia, and a little bit more than half of the people supported a ban of children being adopted and sent to the United States. And a lot of this was about Russians feeling that we should be taking care of our own. So Putin today, in his comments, raised that issue and talked about sort of, restoring some pride in Russia and taking care of orphans, and that they're going to spend more resources on that. Question is, how quickly can they do that? There's more than 100,000 children in state orphanages in Russia. About 18,000 Russian families have applied for adoption. So there's a lot of children that are still looking for homes. Right.
I mean, I know that the US ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, has been quite outspoken in his criticism, even going to Twitter to talk about how he says he agrees with hundreds of thousands of Russians who want children removed from political debate. Talk us through how many American families are likely to be affected by the ban, or perhaps let me rephrase that and say how many Russian orphans now are likely to not be found adoptive parents and adoptive families in this country.
Well, the number of children that are being adopted from Russia in recent years has been declining. It's still, Russian children are still it's still the number 3 country in terms of orphans who are adopted from overseas to the U.S. Just under 1,000 were adopted last year, and before that, the numbers were higher. It's been dropping in recent years. You might remember in 2010, there was a case involving a mother in Tennessee who had adopted a 7- or 8-year-old boy, and then put him back on a plane, sent him back to Russia, saying that he was violent and that she was feared for her life. That created, understandably, quite a controversy and firestorm. And so since then, there's been a lot of back and forth between Russia and the U.S. over this issue. And so the numbers have been dropping.
I know there are also around 50 Russian orphans who are in the process of being found American adoptive families. Now, I know you've been talking to a family in Atlanta who've already got one adoptive Russian son and were hoping to adopt another. Tell me more about their experiences.
Sure. Yeah, it's a family in an Atlanta suburb. They're in their late 40s, Ann and Kurt Seuss. And they adopted in 2007. They brought home a boy who was 13 months old. His name is Ben, from an orphanage just outside of St. Petersburg, Russia. And they were celebrating their Christmas just obviously this week. Earlier this year, they applied to adopt a second child from Russia. Started the process in February. Last time it took them about 10 months from start to finish. They're coming up now on more than 10 months, and they were told even before this ban was passed by Parliament, by the adoption agency, that it could be another 12 to 18 months before they receive any sort of word about even potentially traveling to Russia to move the process forward.
And now I guess if this ban comes into effect on January the 1st, that will be that. Now, just very briefly, Mike, the Kremlin has recently been taking a series of steps to limit US influence inside of Russia, including shutting down things like US aid. What's going on here? Are we likely to see a real breach in Russian-American relations? Are these diplomatic tangles evidence of that? And when it comes to major areas of cooperation between Russia and the US, for example, with regarding transit supplies to US troops in Afghanistan, do you think any of that will be affected?
Right. Well, I think it's a big question, and it's still unclear. There's a lot of mixed messages and signals coming out of Russia. There's some of the authorities in Russia are basically arguing this is more for domestic consumption, and that it's not something that is going to spiral into something much bigger. But sometimes these things take on a life of their own, and so there's quite a bit of concern, not only for the children and whether or not they will be finding homes and families soon, but for broader bilateral relations.
Mike Estelle, our correspondent in Atlanta, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for your time this morning. We'll have to leave it there, but lots more on that story as it develops in the paper and on WSJ.com. Thanks for joining us on WSJ Live.